I'm Joseph Sahrye. I'm the Chief Waterfront Design Officer here at Waterfront Alliance. As those who were the first on the call have now heard three times. Thank you, everyone, for joining today's webinar. We're going to focus on a coastal and waterfront challenge, permitting, or the need for permitting reform, permitting best practices from around the country. Last year, Waterfront Alliance held a permitting reform summit with key stakeholders from around the New York Harbor region. This webinar is going to touch on some of the outcomes of that summit, potential recommendations, and some of the processes and ideas that have come out of both our work, but also the work of our exceptional panelists. There's a number of folks around the region that are working on permitting reform in here in New York. And we've brought some of those minds together, and also ask somebody who wasn't focused on New York out in San Francisco Bay to join as well to provide some national perspective. I'm happy to introduce our panelists today. We have Danielle Bissett. She's a certified ecological restoration practitioner and former adjunct professor with experience in planning, designing, permitting, constructing, and monitoring restoration projects in New York City. She's currently the Restoration Permitting Policy Lead for EPIC, which is the Environmental Policy Innovation Center. And really her expertise is just what groups around the country are doing in terms of permitting reform. I think what we've found in multiple meetings and summits and workshops that we've joined with Danielle is that she's got an example and a case study for everything. Dan Shtob is the environmental sociologist and assistant professor of sustainability and health at Michigan Tech University. He's a former Brooklynite and practicing attorney. And he works on everything from disasters, policy and regulatory matters, complexity science, and other elements of interactions among human and environmental systems. Why he's joining us today is that he's the co-PI and research lead on a project funded by the Hudson River Foundation and supported by CUNY and the Science and Resilience Institute of Jamaica Bay. Their project, which will kind of merge at some point with Waterfront Alliance's permitting work, is really around analyzing and understanding where regulatory barriers are to shallow water ecological restoration in New York Harbor, and what are the best practices for regulators and restoration professionals to collaboratively overcome them. And then Sahrye Cohen is a wetland biologist and manager at the EPA Region 9 Wetlands and Oceans section. Her team does Clean Water Act and marine protection research and Sanctuaries Act science regulation grants. She's interested in developing active partnerships to advance multi-benefit restoration and nature-based solutions, and developing capacity at the federal, tribal, and state agency levels to protect water quality and beneficially reuse dredge material. She has over 20 years of experience in aquatic biology research, marine policy, and was previously with the Army Corps of Engineers out of the San Francisco district. So I'm going to go ahead and walk through a couple slides to go through a little bit of background on Waterfront Alliance's work and where we are today. We've got a survey that we're going to request your support on to help us learn a little more from you all about some of the challenges in this space. But David, if we could advance the slide. So Waterfront Alliance, for those who don't know, is a New York Harbor-based organization. We're a nonprofit that leads the way for thriving and resilient waterfronts, shorelines, and coastlines. Most of our work is focused here in New York Harbor and the New York Harbor region, which is both New York City and northern New Jersey. And that ranges from everything from education work in middle and high schools, policy advocacy, which is where, the direction that we'll kind of go today. We're doing resilience planning with New York City parks in both Coney Island and in Flushing Meadows Corona Park. And then we also do public access work around the region. And then our national work is the Waterfront Edge Design Guidelines, or WEDGE standard. That's the program that I lead, which is a resilience and ecology standard for waterfront developments across the country. Go ahead for the next slide. This is not our first foray into permitting. From 2009 to 2012, approximately. Waterfront Alliance put together a report on improving waterfront permitting in the New York, New Jersey Harbor estuary. That turned into kind of this recommendation around a one-stop shop for permitting, and that evolved into what is today still the Waterfront Navigator that New York City Economic Development Corporation hosts. And I know that, you know, practitioners around the region rely on a regular basis. That idea and kind of the initial versions of it lived with Waterfront Alliance. That was the main outcome. There were other recommendations in that study, but the main outcome was what eventually turned into that Waterfront Navigator. That's still in use today. If we fast forward to today on the next slide, there have been, whoops, go back one. Um, picking up the ball again last year, we asked Latham and Watkins, the environmental law firm, to do a series of interviews with some of the projects that were fairly complicated to permit from either from both the public and the private sector to help understand where are some of the barriers today and what's changed over the last 10 years. We then followed this up with a 2024 symposium on permitting. And then as we've attended like Dan's workshops at CUNY and the Science and Resilience Institute of Jamaica Bay, we've heard the same things that came up in the Latham and Watkins report, our symposium, the same things that people are sharing there as well. And that's that there are overlapping regulations and agencies, and a lack of clear lines between them, long project timelines that, you know, when a permit agency is promising, you know, a 60-day review, oftentimes that is extending to 8, 9, 10 months, if not more. Part of that is a result of just lack of staffing at these agencies that uh, um, uh, staff retention is a challenge, funding is a challenge, and kind of the more complex of a project you're putting through, the more of a factor that becomes. There's a focus on environmental impacts, purely reducing harm as opposed to thinking bigger picture about the environmental benefits or what this looks like in a climate change scenario. And that has impacts on, you know, both the natural elements, but also the resilience elements of projects. We've heard from partners that there's a lack of holistic review or prioritization and kind of which projects are going through the process most smoothly. Unpredictable standards, and that kind of ties back to that overlapping regulations and agencies. We're hearing that there are complications with SBS and a lack of this New York City Small Business Services. It's the local New York City agency that does a lot of waterfront permitting. There is a process in New York that is writing a waterfront code that'll live with Department of Building. So that process will change a little bit. And then also concerns on both sides around liability and risk aversion. And some of that is tied on the agency side to, if we get this wrong and there are environmental impacts, we are on the hook. And then the risk aversion and on the practitioner side is, if we are trying to do a living shoreline, more restorative work as opposed, oops, we lost the slides, more restorative work as opposed to the bulkhead wall that's easy to bring in and to get permitted, you're adding risk to the project from a timeline and cost perspective. All of these are things that, you know, we've heard in multiple forums. Waterfront Alliance itself does not have permit applications in front of any of the agencies. But this is what we very consistently are hearing from partners. If we go to the next slide, what we could still use help on, and I'll ask one of my colleagues to put this link in the chat as well. One of the challenges as we think through what permitting reform looks like in and how we get the attention of elected officials and others, permitting is not a particularly sexy topic for most people. So we do need to start to understand what are the costs of a permitting system that isn't functioning as smoothly as it should, and with the outcomes that that are going to be the best for the environment for New Yorkers. So this survey is going to ask you questions about like what is the timeline that you're using when you're projecting how long a permit process is going to take. When are you submitting documents? How many notice of incomplete applications are you getting? What this is going to help Waterfront Alliance understand is what are the real costs of this? Is this costing millions of dollars on a project? Is this costing a hurricane season on a resilience project? And as we, over the next year, move into a more advocacy position on some of the reforms that we'll talk about today, this will help us draw attention to the need for that, because this is something that's really not on the general public or even the general elected officials' radars. So we'd encourage folks to take that survey. The link is in the chat. I would love to turn it over to the panelists. I've got a list of questions. We're going to use the Q&A function that you have at the bottom of your screen. So feel free to ask us questions. We're going to hold time at the end to go through audience questions. But I'd like to start with Sahrye first. There's a lot of overlapping agency jurisdictions, conflicting regulations that affect project delivery. How does that work in your city? And are there models of successful interagency coordination that could be scaled or replicated?
Hi, well, thank you very much for including me in this conversation. I'm excited to be here to talk about some of the efforts that we've been working on in San Francisco Bay. Primarily, the project that I've been involved with is the Bay Restoration Regulatory Integration Team. And this is an effort that kind of grew out of 2017, a number of workshops and discussions of both restoration practitioners, flood control districts that were actively working on shoreline restoration, many other projects and proponents, in addition to resource and regulatory agencies. And basically, we decided to form a group that came from very much the staff and I would say first line initial manager level of regulatory and resource agencies to try to do integrated permitting. So we recognize from our practitioners, one of them in particular wrote a sand in the gears document that identified many of the same challenges that we just heard for San Francisco Bay as well. And kind of our hypothesis was that if we had a robust pre-application period, we could coordinate the information needs, coordinate the performance requirements, and work through those. We did try to do specific timelines, and we found that actually was incredibly hard. So that's something that I feel gets suggested very often is why don't we just have 120 days, or why don't we say you have to issue permits within this timeline? And we were not necessarily able to achieve that, but what we were able to achieve was timeline responsiveness. So working with the applicants as participants in that process and figuring out when they needed permits by, and trying to have the agencies work together to meet those timelines. And so this was very much kind of a grassroots regulatory resource agency process. There are many other processes that are going on in California and San Francisco Bay that have to do with programmatic permitting, statutory exemptions, like cutting the green tape that I hopefully we'll get to talk about a little bit later. And so we found that one of the biggest things that this did was it created dedicated staff. So instead of having a permitter who worked on your project and then another one, we were able to kind of create staff consistency. And that's been a huge benefit towards getting complicated shoreline permits done. And we're talking not just about restoration projects, but multi-benefit restoration projects. So public access, restoration, sometimes nature-based solutions. So very complex projects.
Great. And certainly similar challenges to what we see here in New York. Any of the other panelists want to add to that, or should I go to the next question, which I think we're going to ask Danielle next. So Danielle, what are some of the most significant bottlenecks that you're seeing in the permitting process, and how are they impacting either climate resilience or waterfront projects? And are there examples where there are streamlined processes in other places where that have worked well?
Yeah, so I do just want to take a minute to also talk about the biggest challenge, which is that our environmental regulations were designed to prevent and minimize harm from development and industry projects, but now creates a barrier for restoration projects trying to repair that harm. But to be clear, though, we don't want to overcorrect and get rid of regulations, because not too long ago, the Bronx River, where I started my career as a practitioner, was basically an open sewer. And now with all the work that dozens of groups and leaders have contributed to, it's a natural resource for wildlife recreation. And there's still a lot of work and restoration to do, which is why we need to implement smart permitting solutions to help us advance this critical work. And at EPIC, we've documented that restoration projects consume up to 1/3 of their project budgets on permitting. And mitigation banks take over 1,000 days to permit and approve, which should only take up to 225 days. And so we see that restoration projects, even though they have positive environmental outcomes, are really delayed and are overburdened. So at EPIC, we like to think about 3 strategic approaches to this work, and that's the first is getting through the permitting process faster. So think of it like building a fish ladder over a dam. The dam is still there, the problem is still there, but you're providing some type of workaround, some type of efficiency, some type of support line. The second is fundamentally changing the permitting process. And so you could think of this as actually removing the dam. And the third is raising the bar on avoiding impacts, which is don't even build the dam, right? So those are the 3 ways we like to think through this. And I think it helps us highlight the regulatory mismatch between our regulatory and natural systems. So during the permitting process, these sites continue to degrade over the years it takes to obtain permits. Budgets are consumed by paperwork instead of actual restoration. And by the time permits are obtained, inflation has driven up costs, and the site is sometimes worse than when you first designed the project. And I think that there are a number of really great examples across state and national levels that speak to how we can improve the process and why we don't have to be initially afraid to kind of touch this topic. The first that I always love to talk about is the Maryland Department of Environment Stream Team. A few of you have definitely heard me talk about this one before. We have 3 total staff responsible for reviewing and approving permits for stream restoration projects in the entire state of Maryland. 96% of the restoration permits they reviewed in 2024 were reviewed and approved in less than 90 days. And I think a really other big thing that they do is on their website, they distinguish that these restorative projects are fundamentally different from development projects. So right off the bat, there's some really great language there and mindset shift. Another example is in Virginia. They have a permitting enhancement and evaluation platform. It's a tool, a piece of technology that helps improve the permitting process through real-time tracking and coordination. And in just about 2 years, they've reduced permit timelines by 70%, streamlined 50,000 regulatory requirements, and saved about $1.2 billion. And again, please cut me off if I'm going too long, Joseph, but I have a few other examples that are also pretty impressive. Colorado's dredge and fill law, which was developed post-Sackett, was an effort in Colorado to protect natural areas that were covered by Army Corps' jurisdiction. And those state legislators included language that exempts voluntary stream restoration projects from additional regulatory review, as long as they meet certain criteria. So again, a really great way of showing how legislators are kind of meeting the moment to improve this process to advance restoration projects. They're also now working on the implementation of that law, so stay tuned. And another great example is Washington's Habitat Recovery Pilot Program, which launched in 2021 to help habitat restoration projects move through permitting faster while complying with environmental regulations. They've done a really great job at approving permits within 45 days. So I think all that to say is there are some really great examples out there that show this work can be done. It's not novel. It might be novel in your state, but there are really great examples that we can learn from. And the conversation needs to continue to happen so that we understand what gaps still remain so that we can apply innovative solutions to those.
And so many case studies is why we wanted you to join. So thanks for sharing all of those. I want to go to Dan now. I think one of the things that your study has done really well is to engage the actual agencies themselves in the process. So many times and this is would be a fair critique of Waterfront Alliance's approach as well, is that we're starting with the practitioners, and keeping have kept the practitioner and the agency voices a little separate. But one of the things that, if you're not paying attention, it could seem like all of these challenges with the status quo are just things that we need to blame DEC and Army Corps or SPS or whatever the agency is that you could say, oh, this is clearly just their fault, but that's not fair at all. That this is the folks in these agencies are doing really incredible and difficult work with very few resources, because this isn't the kind of thing that gets a ton of state funding. So I'm curious, from what you've heard in the workshops and the interviews that you've led, the lack of agency staffing does impact the quality and speed of permitting reviews. What are the strategies that you're hearing that would help actually build their capacity and improve efficiency and this is the important part, without actually compromising oversight?
So I have a few thoughts. And just as a preface, I mean, one of the really important things that we learned in our inquiries is that regulators want improvement just as much as anyone else, right? This is a systemic issue, not an individual issue. It's easy to point fingers and throw stones, but what you really want to do is empower regulators to do their jobs more efficiently, more quickly, better, and everyone's happier when that happens. Now, the question really is, what do you do in a particular funding and staffing environment to improve efficiency without threatening the values of regulation, right? Regulations serve a really useful purpose. And so, as far back as I went in this literature review, and to paraphrase MC Hammer, I did go around the world from London to the Bay. People have recognized that better funding, better staffing will improve things. More money, more people, more time will always make things run more efficiently, or at least, you hope so. But that's not a particularly interesting question. As you said, the interesting question is, how do you operate within a particular funding and staffing environment? We can all hope that, for example, policy will change to recognize that restoration has resilience effects, at least sometimes. And so that when the state, for example, is promoting a coastal resilience policy, this is a way of satisfying that. That may result in additional resources being available. But be that as it may, right? While we hope for that, we need to think about how you work within parameters and constraints while also improving efficiency. And one thing I noticed as I was entering into this project is this field offered and suffers from a lack of detail, Danielle being an exception. Oftentimes you will see people say things like, we need better collaboration, right? I love the example from San Francisco of like, here's what collaboration could actually look like, because that's one of the issues that we've been exploring. So in terms of collaboration, you need buy-in, right? And you especially need understanding when collaboration should begin, who should be at the table at the early stage to prevent later surprises, right? You need a very deep review of the project by people who really know what they're doing in order to ensure that every agency that needs to be there is there. And it's somebody at that agency who's authorized and empowered to make the kind of judgment calls that can overcome conflicting agency missions and mandates. Because even though regulators want this system to work more efficiently, they're bound in by laws, right? Their risk aversion isn't for no reason. It's not like they woke up in the morning and said, I'm going to be risk averse today and I'm going to make things run less efficiently. They need to follow the law. They can get sued, right? And so, nobody likes getting sued, especially when you're in official capacity. So using collaborative structures to overcome these mission and mandates, like these times they don't completely agree or they're at odds with each other, and also giving these collaborations, these collaborative bodies, flexibility to find solutions when these agency mandates and missions may not be consistent. And for that, you need people of sufficient authority. You need buy-in up the chain so that it's not, you know, a new regulator sitting in a meeting and feeling like they're going to be in trouble if they mess up. For other ideas about examples of successful collaborations, one thing we've noticed is that compelled collaboration often yields results, and we can use these in models. In our interviews and working with people, there have been several examples of collaborations conducted under consent orders, where there's a judge involved who's, you know, can threaten contempt of court and other sanctions down the line if you don't get your act together. Furthermore, there's been examples of collaborations when it's an issue that carries a lot of political clout. When there's somebody in Albany or at City Hall who really wants to get a project done, all of a sudden everyone can focus. And I wish I could get into more detail, but I'm still doing the final data analysis and I don't want to get ahead of myself. Another example, and this also related to things said by the other panels, are bridge organizations, right? I think EPIC could be one, groups like the Waterfront Alliance possibly, but I also think that in the San Francisco example, this is a little bit of what I was hearing. The idea that there could be an external organization that addresses some deep needs created by understaffing or lack of funds, right? These include some really practical things like the impossibility of any one person, any one regulator, any one practitioner staying abreast of all issues and matters across scientific, design, and local or practical fields that impact any one type of project, much less several project types that often land on the desk of individual regulators. They could serve an informational role, they could serve a hand-holding role, they could tell people what to expect, they could tell applicants what to expect, and they could also predict some of the common problems that arise. Oh, you're, doing things in this area, you know that there's a construction ban due to fish migration, right? Like little things like that that can really throw a grenade into the process of planning and adding time. Another one is bringing funders into the regulatory process, because one of the things we're hearing is that funding timelines and practical timelines, funding requirements and regulatory requirements often don't mesh perfectly. And you want to focus on the things over which you have control, right? You can't, if you think of any of us could rewrite the budget for the DEC or any of the federal agencies, DOS, we would add a few extra people, we'd add some more expertise, we'd add resources. But with funders, you can actually talk to them about the environment that they're going to be working within. So as a final thing, regulators are compelled to work within cost-benefit analyses very often, right? And as Danielle was saying earlier, these cost-benefit analyses are often directed or mandated by outdated or anachronistic laws, right? That were built for development or industrial purposes and now are being applied to restoration. So one way that we could open up the realm of the cost-benefit analysis and kind of work with regulators' risk aversion is by characterizing and justifying other things as beneficial. That could be learning, right? That could be experimental projects that see the harbor as a broader ecosystem where, you learn things in one site, it'll impact other sites. It could be seeing the harbor as a full ecosystem or biome together so that you're not looking at a particular site and you're looking at how one project interacts and intersects with things across the harbor as a whole. And finally, it could be really, expanding, as I mentioned earlier, the realm of what we see as potential benefits so that it intersects with existing policy goals, for example, coastal resilience, right? If you start empowering regulators to make decisions based on these broader, more holistic analyses, it probably would allow them more comfort in making positive judgment calls around projects of this type. I know I've gone over my time, so I'm going to shut up now. But thank you for allowing me to be here and share some stuff that's still very much in process.
Thanks. I want to dig into that balancing environmental protection with the need to advance climate resilient infrastructure a little bit, and either Dan or one of the other panelists, you're welcome to jump in on this. But how do we, when as we've talked about, the laws are so focused on avoiding environmental harm, how do we actually expand those holistic project benefits that you just talked about, and how do we embed the climate resilience benefits in there?
Can I just jump in, and then I know Danielle's gearing up here. But I think one thing is that we often come to these deliberations with a static approach to harbors and ecosystems, thinking that, we need to restore them to a 1974 or 1978, or these kind of arbitrary historical standards. I don't think anyone would characterize the 1970s as a high watermark, pun intended, of harbor health around New York City. But one thing that's really important in the modern day is to understand these ecosystems as dynamic. Change is happening whether you want it to or not, right? Some of the things that we value, wetlands, can be flooded. And, some of the projects that we need involve adding fill, everyone's favorite topic. And so thinking about resilience, not just in a kind of coastal climate disaster from that point of view, but also thinking about it from a basic maintenance of ecological health in a time of dynamism and a time of kind of inevitable change. All right.
Can I jump in, Joe, or do you want to move on?
Go for it.
I think two really interesting examples come to mind when I hear about climate resilience and restoration. So one being the Louisiana's Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority. So this way of governance around restoration, resilience, coastal processes, all of that under one agency, one authority, is really important, because you get that holistic approach, you get that comprehensive thinking. You're thinking about not just this one single project, but you're thinking over time scales and ecosystem types. So to date, I think that they started in 2007. They were established in 2007. They've secured nearly 22 billion in funding for these projects, completed 150 restoration projects, restored over 71 miles of barrier island, like these big numbers, because it's one single agency that's pushing this work forward. They create, the moment that their 5-year plan comes out, they start working on the next one. Like they're an engine. It's also exciting to know that Louisiana just passed an upland version of the Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority. So it's really exciting to see. And the second thing, just again, the intersection of climate resilience and restoration is under FEMA. So the Floodplain Enhancement and Recovery Act was just introduced by Senators Murray she's a Democrat from Washington, and Steve Daines from Montana, a Republican. So this is a bipartisan legislation that creates distinct pathways for ecosystem restoration projects in regulated floodplains while maintaining flood safety standards. So again, it's kind of showing how people are trying to approach this idea of creating resilience through restoration while updating existing policies and processes and things through many different ways. So I think, again, it's not novel. People are working on this. They're really good examples. And the risk is always there, right? It's a scary thing to sometimes think about, but there are some really great examples to learn from.
I want to go to Sahrye now to look at San Francisco and how their water infrastructure are there. you've plugged in on some of the New York City stuff, and I'm curious what lessons you think we could learn from San Francisco's approach, including like the Cutting Green Tape initiative is a good example. And then well, stop there, and then we'll get the follow-ups.
Okay, great. So my philosophy behind this is that this is a yes and situation where we are not just able to solve kind of the idea of regulatory or permitting reform through one thing, that we need collaborative permitting, we need streamlined solutions, we need leadership that understands risk and uncertainty and is able to support kind of paradigm shifts in the way that people think, and also the flexibility inherent in the regulations. I do believe that there is flexibility in the Clean Water Act and the Endangered Species Act that allows us to do ecosystem level work. And so some of the ways that we've looked at this intersecting are California has had an initiative for about the last 5 years called Cutting the Green Tape. And it basically is a state level program. So it's coordinating kind of on the state agencies, which doesn't necessarily mean federal agencies as well. There's some duplicative permitting and overlapping authorities there. But one of the main things that is working with this project is statutory exemptions for restoration projects. And that really comes from like the top levels of California government. It means that projects that are restoration projects have to meet certain criteria. They have to have public access or recreation. They have to focus both on long-term net benefits to resiliency, biodiversity, and species recovery, and also ongoing procedures and management for protection of the environment. So that's one big thing, is the statutory exemption. They also were able to take basically 5 state approvals from the California Department of Fish and Wildlife and consolidate those kind of into one. So that's a big streamlining for state level permissions. And then they also were able to do a consistency determination where California's Endangered Species Act are able to adopt the federal Endangered Species Act incidental take. And so this has been something that we've seen worked on a lot of projects throughout California. This is not the only collaborative kind of streamlining work that's been going on. There are also sustainable conservation has been working on a water quality certification for large-scale restoration projects. National Marine Fisheries Service has restoration orders. So there's many overlapping things here. So one of the things that we've seen is EPA is actually looking at how does this interact with the projects that are being authorized that are multi-benefit restoration projects through the BRIT. Is there an overlap where we can get kind of a plus up from using these programmatic tools or statutory exemptions with kind of the collaborative permitting framework? And I think what's really powerful for some of these things, if people are looking at statutory exemptions, is how can we programmatically make these collaborative, right? San Francisco Bay is, I would say, intensely collaborative and consensus driven. It doesn't have one single authority. So unlike Louisiana, there is no one agency that gets to decide things. There's 18 different agencies or cities. It is a patchwork, even more so than I think New York. And so there is really strong equity, community involvement, and tribal nations. And sometimes when we do these statutory exemptions, we cut those folks out. So if we are thinking about those as regulatory pathways or ways that we are going to do permitting reform, we have to really look at how those decisions affect those communities, those nations, and their interests, and make sure that that is accounted for when we're building these. So I'm really excited. I think in the future, hopefully I'll be able to talk about how some of these programmatic and exemptions have overlapped with the collaborative permitting. It's something that we are definitely at EPA very interested in seeing if we can get these things working together.
Kind of end us on a positive note, and then also encourage more folks to put questions in the Q&A function after this. This will be my last question. It'll go to all panelists, and then we'd love to jump to audience questions. But to end on a more positive note, can you talk about just your number one thing you would change in the process to reduce a barrier in permitting? And also, let's start with Dan, then Danielle, then Sahrye.
Ooh, yikes. This is a really, really hard question because, our memo has like something like 25 recommendations, so it's picking and choosing. I think that it would be um changing our overall approach to understanding why regulators are risk averse, why practitioners are not, why funders operate in the way that we do, so that we're speaking kind of the same language around many of these issues. I feel like very often people who, from our interviews, from our workshops, people who share similar goals don't really understand why others interact with those goals in a certain way. And so the conversations go right past each other. I think that oftentimes the solutions are more simple than we make them out to be, but the process of getting to the solutions and dealing with the context surrounding the solutions is incredibly complex. And so we tend to default to, oh, this one's to blame, that one's to blame. But I really think, like, as in any interdisciplinary collaboration, the science of team science comes into play. And I wish we could apply some of the teachings about ways to communicate across difference, ways to communicate across disciplinary boundaries, ways to communicate around such simple things like the word resilience having wildly different definitions to people who work in different fields and interact with it in a certain way. I think that would be a starting point to really achieve almost every other goal in the process. And a lot of that involves kind of just getting in the head and the requirements that are confronted by people in other roles.
Danielle?
Yeah, like Dan, a few things come to mind. I think in the current system that we have, we need to have a greater understanding between like our community of professionals, between practitioners, regulators, legislators, around the science that's like driving these projects forward, so that there's a bit more, I like to say, quality in, quality out. If applications and projects are being presented that are of high quality, it makes regulators' jobs a bit easier to go through those projects and to see why they're being proposed, how they're being justified, and so on. So I think continuing to refine that and to work towards a greater understanding between these groups of people is important, so that science is leading more and we can address risk aversion in a more practical way. I think that there are really great tools and tech out there that can help, and having more data standards and high quality data to help lead that is happening. And there are really great examples around that. And I think we really need to start seeing different pathways to seeing how restoration is viewed differently than development. And I think that's like, those are positive things that are happening. More people are shifting from talking about challenges to looking towards solutions. And yeah, I think that's kind of it on my end. And also, I just want to share that if anybody is working on permitting reform or has a restoration project story to share, please reach out to me. I'm always happy to talk about what's working and what are the gaps we still need to innovate around.
And Sahrye?
So I have been really struck by some of the permitting reform work that's ongoing in California. And I really like the idea of emphasizing outcomes over process, right? There are many different ways we can get here, but for a lot of places, when we think about what the shoreline values, what we want the shoreline to be in the future, what we want the ecosystems to look like, what are the flood control needs, we have a lot of that information in many places, or it's being developed through regional shoreline planning work. So, how are we going to get there? Are there permitting pathways? Are there statutory exemptions? Is there leadership for a paradigm shift? that interprets how we get those projects. So, you know, I'm not stuck on any one way, but like the goal needs to be the outcomes, and we need to recognize that those are kind of the performance metrics we're looking for. You know, so not necessarily on a project by project level, but how do we get to the regional shorelines that we're looking for, the ecosystem values, functions, and needs that we want to have, and making that the primary like centerpiece, and then using all the tools in the toolbox to get there.
So we'll jump to audience questions now. I think, Danielle, you're probably the best to answer this first one. Are there any states with public databases of working waterfront restoration projects that you would recommend? This person would love to see examples of different projects.
Yeah, so I'm trying to find it right now. Duke Nichols Institute for Energy and Environment. They have an interesting mapping tool that shows active restoration projects along, I think within 2 or 3 adjacent states. And they're just starting to build this resource. It's part of a pretty big project that was recently awarded to these states for coming together regionally to work on restoration projects across state boundaries. And then also part of the Louisiana Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority, they have a really interesting mapping tool that can show restoration projects along the coast. And specifically in New York City, though, I do not know of any, I don't think. Oh, sorry. There is Natural Areas Conservancy has a ecological assessment mapper that does show kind of what's going on, what are the needs, in addition to Hudson River Foundation's mapping tool as well. So I can pull those up, Joe, or I can send them to you and then we can send them out later, but it might take me a minute.
Yeah, we can certainly circulate any links to the full group, and we'll, in follow up to this, also send that permitting survey. Another question that's come in is, how would you and I'll let the group decide who takes this one first. So thinking about a small scale kind of novel pilot project in New York Harbor, something like an experimental artificial cold water reef. How would you go about trying to permit that? If it's experimental, we'll kind of leave funding out for now.
Let me jump in here and say that I think one of the things that we have been really supportive in my region is of pilot projects, right? We approach them as something that you can learn from. And so I think one of the necessary things that, you know, the way that the groups that I've worked with would approach this is to have that entry point into a pre-application, let's say, getting all the groups together that might be needed for permitting this, and looking at what are the requirements, how it will be monitored, what we can learn from it. You know, we have done several small scale permitting for oyster reefs, eelgrass restoration, other kinds of bay projects in San Francisco Bay. And I think one of the important things there is making sure that people know what the outcomes you're looking for are. And we really encourage pilot projects as a way to learn and then leverage those into larger nature-based solutions.
Great. Another question that's come in is, whether folks have seen strategies for engaging meaningful stakeholder feedback.
To clarify, when you say stakeholder, who is it that you're talking about? Like which group of stakeholders?
If the person who asked that question wants to expand or ask another question in the chat, would love a little more context on this. This is something Waterfront Alliance can speak to as well, potentially, depending on the audience that we're looking for here. Another question that's come in while we're waiting for that is that many federal agencies have recently published new regulations or guidance on NEPA implementation. Have you seen any changes that might speed up restoration work? Sahrye, you look like you want to say something.
I mean, I'm interested on the takes on Dan and Danielle's takes on this. I think NEPA reform is a perennial topic. There's always a lot of rulemaking about the timelines and how do we streamline it. I think that there is the possibility. What I'd like to see us do is meet this moment. There is clearly a hunger for permitting reform, and we are seeing that happen in energy sectors, maybe in mining sectors. There is no reason at all why we should not also look at it through shoreline protection, environmental resiliency, wetland, shoreline restoration, right? Like, what are the needs that we have in permitting reform? How does that fit with NEPA regulation? And can we basically, as a group, meet this moment and say that we find this just as important as the other reasons that people might be doing NEPA reform, changing timelines? Can we basically use it to make this work? So that's what I'd really like to see. I haven't seen projects go through this yet, obviously. I think it might have some interactions with community engagement that I'm really looking to make sure that we are not missing out on meaningful community engagement. But I also think that it has the potential for us to really highlight what are the outcomes that we are looking for these projects, and can we, as different regions, highlight those needs and get those projects in the ground.
Yeah, and just to add, I put a blog that one of my colleagues wrote on CEQ's recent action plan. And there's some cautious optimism in there because it does look at making the maximum use of technology in environmental review and permitting processes for a bunch of different types of projects, which could be applied to restoration, but oftentimes restoration is the last one to the table. So just for sake of time, feel free to reach out with any questions after reading that.
And a little more context on the engagement question. The reason that this person raised it is that they're concerned that stakeholders are submitting negative comments on projects, making suggestions that aren't feasible. So in the project design process, what are ways that that a project team can set up the stakeholder engagement process to maybe not necessarily lead to negative permit outcomes. I will add, and I'll put it in the chat, the wedge manual, the Waterfront Edge Design Guidelines. There's a credit in there, 0.3, that's all about implementing a diverse stakeholder engagement process, or diverse and equitable. That offers a lot of guidance on different ways that you can do engagement well, and some metrics behind that. That would be a good place for folks to start. But I'm curious from the rest of the panelists, where you see that pipeline between community engagement and the regulators themselves, and kind of what the risk of having negative comments reach regulators is.
I mean, there's a few ways to answer this. I think the first one is that community engagement, again, has been advanced in recent years as a valuable policy element, right? You want projects to reflect community needs, community input, and this has, really taken off in many fields. Enhancing the value in these processes of, like, here's the benefits, right? Again, we'll can enter into the cost benefit analysis that's shaped by regulators. I think that this is recognized as a really big issue because very often there are suggestions, as the commenter said, that aren't feasible or run afoul of what regulators might expect, but they're sensitive to local conditions, local needs, and so on and so forth. I think another way of answering this is that if you think about the project proponents as being stakeholders of the regulatory agency, everyone that I spoke to, literally every regulator that was interviewed, pleaded for project participants to not, people who are designing projects, people who are building them, people who are shepherding them, to not be afraid of them, right? To not be afraid of the regulator and like really work on informal channels, to get back to what Danielle said earlier about workarounds, and also what Sahrye said about being outcome focused, right? Give the regulator a call. Don't blindside them and say like, oh, by the way, there's all these community engagement things that we've done. There's all of these things that are motivating the exact structure of the project. I want to let you know about this really early. Get on the phone, talk to them, especially about things that might be new in their world, or especially about things that might be unexpected. And so I think that like there's the level of stakeholders. There's the regulatory agency stakeholders, or the project participant, or, project designers. The project designer stakeholders are communities and the people they're trying to serve. Sometimes these needs, I mean, everyone recognizes sometimes these needs may be inconsistent, but really triggering that conversation extremely early in the process, to sensitize everyone. And then rather than waiting for like, the 6-month response time or timeline, get to know your regulator, make friends.
I'll also just add, make sure your purpose and need are crystal clear. As a practitioner who did engage a lot of communities and different groups within these projects during the design phase to down to them, it's just really important to communicate that purpose and need, and to make sure you talk about all the assumptions that people might be holding on to, but might not be vocalizing. So yeah, I'll just say that as well. I can jump into Matt's question.
Go for it.
So Matt, we did see some interesting updates to improve permitting for voluntary restoration projects under Nationwide 27, in addition to a new nationwide permit for fish passage and other aquatic species, and inclusion of nature-based solutions in multiple nationwide permits. So we have a write-up of it here. And let me just make sure I'm sharing it to everyone. Okay, let me know if you can access that, and Matt, feel free to reach out if you have any questions.
All right. Well, we've hit 1 o'clock. I want to make sure that we end on time for folks. But Danielle, Dan, Sahrye, thank you so much for being with us today. We appreciate your insights, your partnerships, and looking forward to continue to working on these issues over the coming years. Thanks everyone for who is in the audience for joining today.
Thank you.
Thank you for the invitation.